Thanks very much, Will, and let me just join the chorus of thanks to Peter for organizing such a wide-ranging and stimulating conference. I have learned so much in the last day and a half, and looking forward to learning more this afternoon. So recent work on classical drama, and particularly on Attic tragedy, that draws on cognitive science, has tended to fall into two distinct, if often overlapping, categories. Studies that look at what happens when audiences receive and make sense of dramatic performances, and studies that draw on the insights of modern research for ways of understanding the cognitive processes of characters within the plays. This paper falls within the second of those categories and takes its most immediate bearings from a brief but suggestive and already quite influential essay by Felix Budelman and Pat Easterling entitled Reading Minds in Greek Tragedy. Budelman and Easterling build on work in psychology, philosophy of mind, and neuroscience that is concerned with what is often called mind reading, and that's something that we already heard about yesterday, particularly in Paul Dilley's paper. This is work by a wide array of researchers that include cognitive psychologists such as Simon Baron-Cohen and Bertram Moll, and cognitively inclined literary critics such as Alan Palmer and Lisa Sunshine, that examines the assumptions or theories of mind or folk psychologies through which all human beings perform the fundamental, indispensable task of figuring out what other people are thinking. Budelman and Easterling propose that paying attention to how the tragedians represent mind reading might be more productive than the more familiar but vexed and contested quest to capture their portrayals of character. Character being an elusive phenomenon that is possibly more pertinent to modern than to ancient literature. Their paper is an attempt, as they put it, to investigate the benefits of looking at the plays as presenting us with looking at the plays not as presenting us with characters, but as modeling the dynamics of reading minds. And I think it's in that concept of modeling that you can see the potential overlap between what happens in a play and what happens between a play and its audience. My talk takes up this suggestion in relation to one of the most challenging passages in Greek tragedy, the so-called deception speech in Sophocles' Ajax. This is the speech in which Ajax appears, at least to his wife Tecmessa and the loyal followers who form the chorus, to renounce his previously announced decision to kill himself. He speaks of his plans in ambiguous terms that suggest a purification ritual rather than a suicide, and correlates those plans with yielding to the gods and revering the sons of Atreus, the leaders whom he hates and whom he had planned to escape and thwart by killing himself. There is arguably no speech in tragedy that is harder to interpret by means of conventional marks of character, such as intention, motivation, and consistent traits. As an expression of intention, the speech can be read in completely contradictory ways, as a statement that Ajax intends to kill himself, or as a statement that he does not. For most interpreters, his actual intention when he gives the speech can be determined retroactively on the basis of the fact that he does go ahead and kill himself. But that still leaves the real difficulty of deciding what Ajax's intentions are in relation to the speech itself, whether he intends it or does not intend it to give the misleading impression to its auditors that it certainly does. This question of whether Ajax is being deceptive cannot be satisfactorily answered in terms of conventional ideas of motivation. For many scholars, going back to Welcker in the 19th century, it is simply out of character for a heroic warrior like Ajax to be deceptive. If that consideration is put aside, whether because it's not so clear that heroes aren't actually capable of being deceptive, or whether because Ajax has in fact been acting out of character throughout the entire play, it's still hard to see how deceiving his auditors, and especially Tecmessa, can be reconciled with the opening words of the speech in which Ajax volunteers an account of his own state of mind, With a strong emphasis on change as an inescapable, if unexpected, phenomenon, he announces that he now feels a new sympathy for Tecmessa. Deceiving Tecmessa seems like a strange way to respond to feelings of sympathy. His deception of her could only be temporary and would be followed by even greater pain, which is what in fact occurs. But new sympathy for Tecmessa is also incompatible with the idea that Ajax is not trying to deceive her and thinks of himself as announcing an unaltered intention to kill himself, since it is Tecmessa who has been intent on persuading him not to do that, especially by trying to awaken his sympathy for her. Furthermore, when Ajax equates his intended action with yielding to the gods and doing reverence to the sons of Atreus, this seems so out of character that a number of distinguished critics, beginning with Bernard Knox, have concluded that he must be being sarcastic. The detection of sarcasm is a critical move that is hard to rule correct or incorrect, but it certainly suggests a critical impasse, a point at which a text cannot be comfortably processed in a more straightforward way. Finally, Ajax voices a perspective on his coming death, and especially its relation to his own future status in cult, that his mind can hardly be expected to contain, couched in various forms of indeterminate or superhuman expression. The polysemous gnome, the visionary words of a prophet, the extraordinary language of mystic initiation. The softening towards Tecmessa that has occurred during that time off stage, to which we have no direct access, has brought with it, as he says, a new way of speaking. As he puts it, he has been made female with respect to his stoma. As a result, the suicide we are yet to see is endowed with a meaning that is different from the suicide we had expected to hear had happened off stage. But the relationship between that new meaning and Ajax's thinking is impossible to pin down. There is simply more being said in this speech that can be correlated with any ordinary sense of a person's state of mind. And so it comes as a relief to turn from trying to bring this speech into line with any workable concept of character to considering how its internal auditors interpret it as they deploy the mind-reading techniques that are part of their basic equipment as functioning human beings. We are offered several brief but telling interpretations by the chorus and then Tecmessa in the unsettled stretch of time between when the speech is delivered and when its meaning is, at least in part, settled by Ajax's suicide. Inevitably, these characters' readings of this overdetermined speech are partial, both in the sense that they are selective and in the sense that they are filtered through the interpreter's own concerns. Responding both to what Ajax says and what he seems to say, they offer a set of variations on the idea of a change of mind, a series of formulations that show what a serviceable, even indispensable concept change of mind is, but also how dubious and slippery. The first of these comes in the famously misguided euphoric choral ode that follows immediately after the speech. There, in the strophe, the chorus cry out that they are impelled to dance and sing by overwhelming joy. In the antistrophe, they articulate their reasons, which are inflected by their own strong desires and ecstatic state of mind. The chorus's interpretation is rooted in a close, selective reading of Ajax's words as their near quotation of the beginning of his speech. They closely echo what he says about the power of time to efface everything that exists, and also about how the fact that he has changed somehow is proof that even the most unexpected things can happen. And that certainly resonates with the various discussions of the unexpected that we've been having all through this conference. But they attach those words to the fulfillment of their own desire, making them apply to the particular change of plan that they want for him and for themselves, as it's not at all clear that they do in Ajax's speech, where they are offered only to explain his own changed mode of speech. The change of plan they impute to Ajax is taken to imply a broader change of feeling or attitude. They assume he is no longer angry at the sons of Atreus. In keeping with the lyric mode of the passage, they seem to lose track of linear time. The change that they understand Ajax to have undergone is not a forward progression into a new state, but a return to a previous condition. Getting a little ahead of themselves in time, since they assume that Ajax has already carried out a set of purifying rituals, they also position him back in the past, declaring that he is lathiponos palin, once again forgetful of troubles. This is a rather paradoxical expression, since it defines a past state of mind through the idea of forgetting what hadn't at that earlier point happened. Interestingly, Stanford, in his commentary on this passage, also finds this idea of returning to a past state in the otherwise unattested verb that the chorus uses for mind-changing, metanagnoste, which Stanford glosses, has had his mind changed back again. The use of the passive here is also remarkable, especially since the closely related and more fully attested verb metagignosko, as opposed to metanagignosko, never occurs in the passive. Changing his mind is apparently not something that Ajax does, but rather something that is done to him. According to Bernard Knox, for whom the idea that Ajax, as an embodiment of the heroic temper, could change his mind is unthinkable, this use of the passive indicates exactly what an alien, unchosen experience this might be. Notably, Ajax himself also uses the passive to report on his perceived internal change when he says that he has been feminized, ephelunthein. So despite their single-minded, self-oriented, and erroneous conviction about Ajax's specific intention, the chorus does pick up something of his speech's mystical collapsing of time and sense of unfathomable external forces at work. But in the subsequent episode, when the messenger sent by Teucer from the camp arrives, and the dramatic mode shifts from song and dance to speech and action, they reiterate their conviction in quite different terms that put Ajax very much in charge of the trajectory of his own mind. When the messenger asks if Ajax is at home, they give this answer. Through an image of internal yoking that evokes self-mastery, Ajax is said to have made new plans that accord with new tropoi, a term which is variously glossed as mood, temper, disposition, and habitus. This formulation once again foregrounds the idea that changed plans are a manifestation of a broader change in attitude or affect. The chorus now projects a quite different narrative than the one they suggested before, not a return to the past, but forward movement in a new direction, a mental progression that is acted out in Ajax's physical movement away from the hut, so that one commentator glosses neois tropois as new actions. When the messenger counters that Ajax's departure from the hut might not be such a good thing, the chorus crisply reiterate their conviction, once again altering the terms but keeping Ajax in charge. Now he has changed his gnome for the better in order to be free of anger and reconciled with the gods. The renunciation of anger now follows rather than defines his change of mind. The messenger crisply dismisses their statement as moria, folly, but it is only after his full report on the words of Calchas that the messenger actually succeeds in convincing the chorus that they have foolishly misread Ajax, at which point they summon Tecmessa to hear this news. This then precipitates her reading of Ajax's speech, which differs from the chorus's several versions because it is now informed by the knowledge that Ajax hadn't actually changed his mind about the suicide, but, and this I find fascinating, it still includes the idea that Ajax has somehow changed his mind. I have now come to realize that I have been deceived and cast out from my former favor. The fact that Tecmessa has better information about Ajax's intention to kill himself does not make her interpretation of his state of mind more definitive or less partial than those voiced by the chorus. Although she seems in the first of these two lines to rule on the question of whether Ajax was being intentionally deceptive, she's actually not in a position to do that. She knows that she misinterpreted the speech, but it's really unclear whether she believes he was deliberately misleading her. Depending on how the genitive of photos is construed, she could be saying she was deceived by Ajax, or simply that she was deceived about him. But in the next line, she does read out of his newly clarified plan a change of attitude or feeling on Ajax's part towards herself. She has been cast out of the charis, the reciprocal relationship of affection and mutual benefit that she enjoyed in the past. This is an entirely understandable but quite dubious reconstruction of Ajax's state of mind, both in terms of the feelings she ascribes to him and in its envisioning of a locatable moment of change. It is contradicted by his own compelling words at the beginning of the deception speech about having changed so that he feels more, not less, sympathy for Tecmessa. And it is very hard to know when this change of heart, this casting out from charis, should be imagined to have occurred. For Tecmessa, it's identified with Ajax's seeming failure to be moved by her appeal to charis during their earlier agon. But his rejection of that appeal is actually the affirmation of an existing resolution, not a change of heart or mind. And in fact, we really don't see any of the former charis that Tecmessa alludes to at any point during the play. So if there really was a change, it must have taken place even before the play began. This is a problem that's reminiscent of another problem that haunts the play, namely, when exactly did Ajax begin to be mad? When did he start being no longer in his right mind? Here, Tecmessa is evidently extrapolating from her own distinct moment of recognition that Ajax was not thinking what she wanted him to be thinking, to construct or reconstruct a corresponding moment of rejection on his part. A discrete event occurring in her mind becomes, on her interpretation, a discrete event occurring in his. So these passages that I've been looking at show both the chorus and Tecmessa engaging in proficient acts of mind reading. They attribute states of mind to Ajax on the basis of their selective interpretation of cues that are in his speech and in his actions, interpreting them in relation to their own expectations and their own hopes and fears. In this process of attribution, they rely particularly on the useful and flexible concept of a change of mind, working with a broad assumption that minds change from one definable state to another, which is a key principle of folk psychology. This concept of change of mind is so serviceable for integrating mixed signals and contradictory pieces of information, so useful a way of putting two things together, that it is embraced even when it strains against the mind reader's sense of what can possibly be expected, as in the case of the chorus, or even when it brings with it the perception of having been rejected and deceived by someone loved and depended on, as in the case of Tecmessa. From the perspective of a modern cognitive scientist, these characters are demonstrating a basic human skill, a mode of understanding and negotiating the world that is essential to successful functioning in interactions with others, something that people who have difficulty functioning, notably, for example, those with autism, lack. From the perspective of a reader or spectator of Sophocles' play, however, those acts of mind reading are competent and psychologically plausible. It's easy to understand how they are arrived at, but also, of course, misreadings, or in the words of the messenger, morias poles plea, full of folly. Whatever is happening in Ajax's mind when he gives that speech, none of these reconstructions can be said to capture it adequately or accurately. He has undergone some sort of change, as he himself announces, but not in the ways that any of his interpreters imagine. He hasn't decided not to kill himself, he hasn't given up his anger at the sons of Atreus, and he hasn't turned against Tecmessa. And the idea of change of mind, which is essential to their formulations, is really muddled. A change of mind can be actively brought about or passively undergone. It represents a turning point in a forward progressing linear narrative, but can at the same time indicate a return to the past, as in the idea of being lathi ponos palin. or may be hard to tie to any particular moment, as in the case of Ajax supposedly casting Tecmessa out of his favor. These readings do not add up to a coherent picture either of what is in Ajax's mind or how minds work in general. Sophocles is just as interested as any modern cognitive scientist in mind reading as a definitive human activity. But for him, that means revealing the inevitable limitations of mind reading, as well as charting the many and various mechanisms by which it functions. Unlike the subjects of contemporary psychological study, Sophocles' characters inhabit a universe dominated by baffling external forces whose principles and purposes are opaque. Under these conditions, they consistently misread other people and their own circumstances in ways that often lead to increased suffering for them and that are often pointed up for audiences through irony. As they struggle to understand the divine powers who shape their experiences, they can only articulate their insights in human language, drawing on concepts from human experience. And the clearest and most accessible formulations of divine purpose that we see in Sophocles foreground the experience of change, the fact that nothing stays the same over time. The idea that divine influence on human lives is manifested by change, which completely pervades Sophocles' plays, is registered with wonderful simplicity by Ismene in Oedipus at Colonus, when she arrives to announce new oracles about Oedipus and sums up his circumstances. This is about the clearest summary of the meaning of Oedipus' life that one ever gets. Now the gods are raising you up before they destroyed you. And understanding that change is a fundamental principle of the universe is expressed by characters who possess particular wisdom or a particular access to sacred mysteries, like Oedipus himself in the same play, who explains this to Theseus. But as Oedipus's opening words make clear, there is a paradox at work here. The gods may be experienced by humans through change, as Ismene suggests, but they themselves are changeless. They alone are free from age and death. Change is a feature of human experience, which necessarily unfolds over time. And the idea of change is a human explanatory tool, an incommensurate, approximate way of getting at an unchanging reality. And so the most illuminating expressions in Sophocles are often paradoxes, asserting that two incompatible things are true at the same time. And the most visionary accounts of change are cyclical, as is, of course, the case in Ajax's deception speech, in which he aligns his plans with a series of recurrent natural alterations: winter and summer, night and day, calm and storm, sleep and waking. Cyclical change as a concept strains against a more familiar idea of change as a linear succession of discrete, incompatible, unforeseeable new conditions, both because cyclical change is constant and permanent, and because any prevailing state predictably implies the emergence of its opposite. Every step forward is also a return to the past. What Ajax is invoking in this speech is a kind of change that is simultaneously a form of non-change, and so provides a poignant contrast with the permanent change from life to death, which he, as he looks ahead to his suicide, assimilates it. And at the same time, it provides a paradigm for thinking about the change he's about to undergo as transcending an ordinary human passage from life to death. As I've already suggested, there's more being expressed in Ajax's deception speech than we normally think of being in a person's mind at any particular moment, in part because it channels a superhuman perspective. And that is one reason the speech does not map easily onto a notion of coherent character. As they interpret that speech as a window on the mind of a character who has throughout the play been presented in contradictory terms, we see his auditors relying on an essential, partial, and merely human cognitive resource, an interpretive schema that takes the form of change that goes in just one direction. So to conclude with a kind of footnote, we see this even in the chorus's response in the lyrics that follow the speech that, as I've already said, seem to capture something of its vision. Even though they are paraphrasing Ajax, The chorus here misses his point about the cyclical character of time. They say simply that time extinguishes all things, panta marine. This limitation to their understanding is pointed out by the fact that our manuscripts include an interpolation that seeks to correct it by adding in te kai flege, and kindles it. This chorus's simpler, more straightforward idea of change is the basis for an attribution that corresponds to their desires and works well for them in the moment, but is not fully adequate to the mind they are trying to read. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Peter, for inviting me for this talk. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very honored too. So my talk focuses today on the specific aspects of ancient Greek tragic stagecraft, the experience of incongruence between the visual and oral stimuli synchronically received by the spectators in the course of a performance. So I propose you to look at and hear of a few theatrical objects in Aeschylus' Oresteia, for which visual effects and verbal cues most probably did not match, and to try to figure out which cognitive processes were implied in the reception of synchronical but discordant visual and oral effects. So this investigation is a small part of a larger project that aims at rethinking the scope and definition of performance studies applied to ancient Greek tragedy. Even in the recent scholarship, one can still find judgments on ancient Greek tragic stagecraft as an austere theatrical art, a minimalist or highly formal performance. And I think that all these labels contain, to some extent, a negative connotation. They all seem to say that, as a general rule, there is not much happening on stage in an ancient Greek performance. So such ideas derive from an essentially visually focused definition of performance, a definition that I would like to challenge by re-evaluating the interplay between oral visual effects and imaginary visualization. Sorry, I just need some time to get a bit less stressed. So it has not been very easy to connect this question with modern cognitive theory. And I am now just starting to investigate this subject. Research on embodied cognition or processing of emotions has been applied to performance studies for about a decade now, and the main orientation as traced by the groundbreaking works of Bruce McConaughey and Rhonda Blair is the exploration of the roles played by mirror neurons, empathy and embodiment in audience reception and acting techniques. But as far as I know, today, multi-sensory interactions as well as interplays between the senses and imagination haven't much come into focus in this burgeoning field. So therefore, I have rather been following another track. Recent research experiments on audiovisual object processing conducted with a combination of behavioral and neuroimaging methods. These experiments question the audiovisual integration of multisensory inputs, sometimes discordant. They also question the principle of visual dominance, which refers to the observation that in bimodal or bimodal environments, vision often has an advantage over other senses. They also question the influence of auditory attention on visual processing. So to resort to these experimental findings in order to get a better grasp of what is ancient performance is not necessarily self-evident and raises a lot of methodological issues. So firstly, this scientific exploration is still in progress, and scientists in this field are dealing with uncertainties. So you can see this, this assertion by Hertz and Amédy. They say that the events in the world are mediated through multiple sensory inputs, and so which need to be integrated to create a unified percept. But even now, how this is done is still not clear. So secondly, as a classical philologist and cultural historian, I am also myself confronted to my own limits. So I know too little about the neuroscience to be capable of telling which hypotheses are plausible, which results are correct or false. So I try to do my best. And third, there is a huge gap between the kind of objects I'm looking at, so theatrical objects that are multi-layered, complex, both material and symbolical, and this kind of objects, so which are used in this kind of experience. So you can see images of mushroom or birds. So in this experience by Schmidt and her colleagues, they were using 12 healthy volunteers, 6 female, mean age 24.9 years, right-handed with normal or corrected to normal vision and without any hearing deficit. So how can I be so daring to think that these volunteers relate in any manner to the 5th century BC spectators of a theatrical production by Aeschylus? So I guess that what makes me persevere in this research is the reasonable assumption that modern humans share some basic biological functions with ancient Greeks. Perception and the processing of the senses have certainly evolved. It is well known that, for instance, sight and seeing were not theorized nor probably experienced in the same way as we do. And the exploration of ancient senses is actually another developing field of research still in progress, as you can see with these 6 new books published by Routledge that you may know on sight, smell, synesthesia, and the other senses will follow. So we cannot assume either that the integration of multisensory stimuli were cognitively processed in the same way as today. But so at the end of the day, in spite of all these limits, it may still be worth following this track. So we see, you will be judged. There is a heuristic challenge that is appealing, and what's more, as hard scientists show to us, even negative results can be a source for progress by pointing to the kind of evidence we would need to achieve more positive results. So sorry if I don't sound very optimistic, but anyway, we'll see. So let's now come to the core of this presentation, objects in performance that give rise to simultaneous but somewhat incongruous verbal cues and visual effects. In the beginning of Eumenides, the divine Apollo staged before as a statue appears at last, finally, in person to defend his protege Orestes. He violently chased the Erinyes who have followed Orestes inside his sanctuary. So with these words, "Out, I tell you, get out of this house at once. Get away from my inner prophetic sanctum in case you find yourself on the receiving end on a winged, flashing snake speeding from my golden bowstring and vomit out in agony black foam taken from human bodies, bringing up the clots of blood that you have sucked." But this is a very aggressive stage entrance that might be a reminiscence of the first Homeric hymn, the god of the bow, Apollo, Toxophoros or Ekatepolos, according to his traditional Homeric and lyric epithets. The god, so in the Homeric hymn, boldly directs his splendid weapon towards the frightened assembly of the gods before being disarmed by his mother. So in the Aeschylean play, although the text does not hint explicitly at the use of the bow as a theatrical prop, it seems fairly reasonable to suppose that the actor who embodied Apollo did actually hold a bow and direct it towards the audience, towards the Erinyes. The bow is an emblematic and iconic attribute of the god that was most probably used on stage to make him recognizable. So as you can see in this passage of Alcestis, Euripides seems to parody this use of the bow, this systematic use of the bow in the prologue. It is my custom always to carry them And there may be a playful meta-theatrical comment on the way the bow was always used, even without any dramatic purpose. So anyway, in the Eumenides, the presence of the bow would actually be meaningful. It gives to Apollo's aggressive orders a much more threatening color. And the silhouette of the actor bending the bow has a pictorial character. So if we look at these images, and the speech of Apollo is relatively long, so that we can imagine a tableau scene, a tableau that may be recognized by the spectators as an iconic imitation of paintings or sculptures of the vengeful Apollo, directing his arrows against the giants or the children of Niobe, like in this vase. So there is a pictoriality, there is an offensive function that can immediately arouse an emotional reaction in the audience. And the bow can be a focus for the spectator's gaze. It probably stood out from its surroundings and could become what the neuroscientists call a salient object, or a locus for foveal vision, as Paradigmatic says. Foveal vision being used for focusing on detail and scrutinizing objects. So there is this image too. So what strikes me then is the distortion between the actual object that was most probably seen on stage and the way the god describes it. Apollo does not speak of bow and arrows, but of a winged flashing snake spinning from his golden bowstring. And you may think that it's just a metaphor that compensates for plain and unimpressive stage business. But I think there is a bit more than that. And the words superimpose on this salient object a somewhat discordant label. The verbal cues are strongly multi-sensory, so if I go back to it. You have the vision is stimulated by the hybrid shape of the winged snake, Pten and Ophin. Snake and arrow were symbolically associated in the collective imagination of the audience. They are compared in treatises on animals and hunting, so that Philippe Montbrun, who wrote a whole book on Apollo's attributes, speaks of the snake as the animal that is the double of the arrow. Then you have the wings. So Aeschylus adds wing to this snake-like arrow. So at first it may be just a metonymic association because the arrow flies. So. The arrow has a fletching of feathers at its back. However, the metaphorical formulation may also arouse in the audience imagination the visualization of a winged serpent, facilitated by the existence of folkloric beliefs about such a composite creature. So, in Herodotus' Book 2, you can find a description of winged snakes. You also have visual stimulation by mentions of color. Argesten means flashing, but also white. You have the golden color with the compound chrysolato. You have also the black foam that the Erinyes are going to vomit. The words of Apollo reactivate a chromatic contrast that is a visual leitmotif throughout the whole trilogy. The contrast between black and the Erinyes are black clad. The white attire of the Olympians and the ominous color of blood that is masterfully staged by Aeschylus in the famous carpet scene. And you have here the allusion to the blood with thrombus phonu. So you have visual cues, you have other verbal sensory stimuli like kinesthetic sense with the motion, the throwing of the arrow, and maybe auditory sensation, especially because the twang of the bowstring was commonly associated with the vibration of the strings of the lyre, the other emblematic attributes of Apollo. And yes, so as you can see, already in Homer, the bow and the lyre are associated, and the bow makes a sound that is related to that of the lyre. So you have very rich verbal cues that enrich the visual spectacle of Apollo bending his bow. with an amalgamation of meaningful visual, auditory, and somatosensory inputs. This first encounter between Apollo and the Erinyes is thus shaped as a kind of supernatural and cosmic battle in which glistening winged snakes oppose the whistling snakes that adorn the hair of the canonic deities. So the god of the sun threatens the daughters of the night. White and gold are opposed to black and red. Dracon against Dracon, to borrow a chapter's title from Ogden's book on Dracon. So I will go quickly because I'm running out of time. I wanted just to allude to another very important object in Aeschylus' Oresteia, the net clause that Clytemnestra uses as a trap for Agamemnon. And we have, I think, the same kind of effect. It was probably staged with pieces of red cloth, but so it was obviously a visual focus in the performance, but the words add a lot to that. It was named by 24 different denominations. It's even called an apparent amphiblesion, so an endless net. There might be here a very symbolical meaning. It's an endless object which forever changes his shape. There is a lot of metaphorical associations. That there is a superabundance of verbal tags. And so powerful and sensory-loaded words overwhelm the visual spectacle worked up on stage. And even in today's big budget production of the Oresteia, it's very difficult to stage this scene. As you can see here, and the carpet scene and the net clause are two sides of the same versatile object. And so there is no material object that can match the versatility and hybridity of the object built by the verbal dramaturgy. Oh, sorry. So let's now move on to the cognitive processing of these multisensory interactions, prompted up by a combination of discordant auditory and visual inputs. So my questions are, can the powerful verbal metaphors forged by Aeschylus affect the visual processing of the spectators watching a show? What happens in the case of incongruence? Does the verbal tag, or do the verbal tags, correct in some way the visual perception of a prop? Could there be a kind of McGurk effect on stage? The McGurk effect being this audiovisual illusion in which an auditory phoneme dubbed onto incongruent visual lip movements tend to lead to an illusory auditory percept. In other words, did the spectators of the Eumenides imagine this? So, when they heard Apollo's words on his bow and arrow, and if so, how did imaginary visual effects interact with real visual effects? These questions are all the more legitimate that in Aeschylus' plays, we can spot enacted thinking of the interactions between sound and sight. So I can't devote much time to this argument, but I will just comment very briefly on another passage very famous in Seven Against Thebes, where you have a visual construal of the sound, reciprocally auditory construal of the sight. So ktupon de dorka, I see the banging noise. There is a very synesthetic image here as the chorus of Theban girls perceive the army advancing towards the city. There is a complete merging of the oral and the visual experience. And there is a great article of Aegis Marinis on this topic, so seeing sounds. So Aeschylus himself proposes this theatrical intuition that postulates a fluid relationship between sound and sight. Did he anticipate on modern cognitive theory? So I will now try to give a very quick account of the progresses made in this field, in the field of human brain processing of multisensory inputs using, through the use of functional magnetic resonance imaging spectral analysis. And I speak now totally under the control or under the authority of a more knowledgeable person than me. But so, first, Each sensory input is processed in a separate cortical regions of the brain at the basis. One speaks, for example, of the visual cortex or the auditory cortex that are located in different specialized areas of the brain. But neuroscientists have been naturally led to ask what happens in the case of multimodal inputs, and especially in the case of incongruent sensory stimuli. So the first thing is that apparently they used to think that there was a kind of cross-modal suppression of the incongruent sensory input. The brain would focus only on the stimulus that seems to be more pertinent or relevant. So that's what they call cross-modal suppression. But in fact, this hypothesis has been challenged in several experimentations that have shown that this does not necessarily apply. On the contrary, Tasman and her colleagues have shown that attention tends to orient more easily towards sensory input that possesses multisensory properties. So the more multisensory you are, the more attention you get. And for spectators in the theater, at least the ideal ones who are actively involved in the performance, the fact to receive discordant visual and auditory inputs does not necessarily demotivate, but on the contrary, may catch their attention even more than congruent audiovisual stimuli. Second point, cross-modal activation of sensory areas, which means the set of processes by which information arriving from the individual sensory modalities, vision, audition, or touch, interacts and influences processing in other sensory modalities. So this has been observed. This is a fact that shows a kind of fluidity of sensory modalities and which has revealed the existence of specific brain areas processing multisensory inputs. So Hertz and Amedi have shown that multisensory inputs are processed simultaneously in primary sensory areas, so visual cortex, auditory cortex, but also in specific cortical regions, so that the green areas on this photo. They speak of audiovisual areal conventions. So then, last point. Other studies have also questioned the hypothesis of visual dominance. For example, so Schmidt, Buchel, and Rose have shown that incongruent visual and auditory stimuli affect neural activity reciprocally. Visual dominance is not assumed to be driven by an inherent dominance of vision over audition, but it's only in specific tasks, especially in temporally demanding tasks, that the processing of visual stimulus is favored as the optimally suited modality for the task at hand. Yet, incongruent visual and auditory stimuli affect neural activity reciprocally. So, I quote, task irrelevant auditory stimuli affected neural activity in the visual cortex. The opposite effect, visual input exerting a modulating influence on auditory processing, has also been processing. Okay, so I conclude. I'm being too long, sorry. This presentation leaves many questions unanswered, but there is much more to research than what I've just presented. But I think this is a truly interdisciplinary field of study because neuroscience, together with literature, poetry, or performance studies, can contribute to improve our knowledge and our understanding of this processing of multisensory stimuli. And here what I'm trying to show is that we have an ancient Greek poet who has theatrical intuition of fluidity between the senses that we can now verify and better understand through the use of fMRI techniques. And we can ask also, and that's what I would like to investigate further, when the spectators of the Oresteia left the theater, what did they remember? Only the material pieces of cloth that they saw on stage, or this monstrous, hybrid, versatile object that the multisensory cues have potentially prompted in their imagination. So I take this investigation into ancient drama and cognitive theory as an impulse to redefine what we understand by performance studies applied to ancient theater. In the recent reference volume by Harrison and Yapis, performance studies are defined as being about non-verbal constituents of ancient theater. So there is a strict dichotomy between verbal and non-verbal aspects of the performance, probably under the influence of Aristotle's definition of opsis. And this seems to me to be too restrictive. This incursion into the processing of multisensory stimuli and the fluidity of the sensory exchanges gives us a cognitive support to argue in favor of the fact that performance is not just about what you see on stage, what is materially represented in the scenic space of the orchestra. The stress should be rather put on the interplay between oral cues, visual effects on the one hand, and the cognitive processes that go on in the imagination of the spectators to the performance. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so with everybody else, I need to thank Peter for organizing this. It's great to come back, and I have a selfish angle to it, too. I started my career working on the Iliad, but since I started working on the Odyssey, I get to keep experiencing homecomings. I'm not saying there's a causal relationship, but I want to, and to an extent, that's part of the theme of the work I'm going to talk about today, our desire to bring stories to their ends and to give them meanings. Of all the papers in this conference, I fear that mine fails to live up to the cognitive science part the most. My interest in Homer and psychology started out from a therapeutic and clinical aspect. Cognitive science has come in rather late as a way to understand certain aspects of the Odyssey's depiction of the working of human minds. The insight of cognitive science is particularly interesting in conjunction with the epic's interest in storytelling, and, as I will focus on today, our nearly obsessive need to bring a story to its end. Now, the Odyssey's consciousness of such an obsession also helps us to understand why it ends the way it does. Since at least the 4th century BCE, there have been questions about why the epic ends as it does. Hellenistic scholars saw resolution in the amorous reunion of husband and wife, while Aristotle saw the epic's telos, or completion, in the payback of the suitors, and had laid out some of that on handout 1. Much later, Eustathius complained that these guys cut off critical parts of the Odyssey, such as the reunion of Odysseus and Laertes, and many other amazing things. And though Book 24 is now largely accepted as essential to the whole, it has been called ugly by one scholar, and lame, hasty, awkward, and abrupt by another. Now, a theme of the epic's final book is partly to blame for its interpretive maladies, namely the theme of endings. Now, this is not merely meta-narrative. The question speaks directly to the Odyssey's status as a poem of life and living and its therapeutic functions. The question of how to end interweaves the dangers of storytelling, the perils of paradigmatic thinking, and the lives that are lived through and outside the poem. To explore these features, I will discuss 3 signs of closure deployed in Odyssey 24, and it's not all of them, but it's all I have time for, and maybe not. So I'll talk about a metathematic conversation, an absent image, and a linguistic pattern. After mentioning the first of these, I will introduce some theoretical frameworks on storytelling and closure to satisfy our need to be sort of open about what is informing our studies. Now, Book 24 starts by modeling how a tale is received and categorized, and you go to the next item on the handout. As Hermes brings the suitors to the underworld, Agamemnon and Achilles contemplate their own status as objects of fame, and in turn, the meaning of their tales. This conversation offers potential paradigmatic endings to a narrative and signals to the poem's external audience that how a story ends is at issue in the final book. Their reminiscence is interrupted by the suitor Amphimedon, who gives his version of the events in Ithaca. In responding to only the part about Penelope, the next item on the handout, Agamemnon again invokes kleos and turns our attention to how narrative is used. He praises Penelope for her intelligence and loyalty, but only as a transition into lamenting Clytemnestra. Despite the availability of Penelope's positive example, women will suffer suspicious rumor because of his wife. Now, the passage reflects more generally on paradigmatic modes of thinking. As I argue elsewhere, in part with the Leadership Project, part of the general interest of the Homeric epics is in exposing the dangers of what Jerome Bruner has called the paradigmatic mode of thought, one that focuses on absolutes, ideals, and categories, dealing generalities in favor or to the detriment of what Bruner calls the narrative mode, the system of thought that makes associative relations and pieces together not absolute outcomes, but the vagaries of agency, imitation, and believability. In the beginning of the Odyssey, the debate between Achilles and Agamemnon and the audience in turn is about that tension of whether or not we're going to turn to a paradigmatic model or we're going to let the story play out to its end. The conversations of the dead invite audiences to think about what kind of tale this epic has been and will turn out to be, and therefore what ending might suit it. Achilles received immortal fame for dying in war. Agamemnon became part of a negative homecoming paradigm with his wife. By retelling Odysseus's killing of the suitors within parenthetical considerations of different types of fame, the epic makes clear that it is his story that is at issue. Now, in my larger work, I would not so abruptly move to theoretical frameworks, but as in the ending of the Odyssey, time is of the essence. It is common to assert that the Odyssey is a story about storytelling, but in this, it is also about what stories mean and how to bring them to an end. Some observations from cognitive science and psychology resonate powerfully with the epic's nearly compulsive interest in interpretation and endings. Human cognition, as many have argued, is conditioned to expect causality and impose it upon the world. Given this cognitive makeup, we respond best to tales that echo our assumptions about causality. This is, to simplify some, implicit in the argument in Aristotle's Poetics that a plot must have a beginning, middle, and end. Each subsequent part of the plot is contingent on what came before. It makes sense that action B follows from action A and that C results from both of them. What Aristotle does not say clearly in this passage is why a plot that is causally connected with the clear end is the best, or dare I say, most pleasurable one. In the movie, When Harry Met Sally, Harry always reads the last page of a book first, so he will know how it ends just in case he dies before he finishes the book. We experience a gnawing frustration from not knowing how a story ends. This feeling can come from the suspense of real life as equally as in delay in completing fiction. One of the models I find attractive is from Mark Turner's work on the literary mind. His understanding of human narrative capacity helps to complete Aristotle's sketch. We intuitively and explicitly expect narratives to come to an end that reflects in a way our own prior understandings. Unmotivated turns or incomplete tales cause us discomfort at conscious, subconscious, and existential levels. We might be tempted to describe this cognitive frame as something of a narrative causality bias, but it is one that we come to almost by necessity and in response to external stimuli. Perspectives informed by cognitive science and psychology and studies in memory emphasize that the thing we think of as a self is a type of evolving narrative text written in relation to our experiences in the world. Observations of early childhood note how infants learn about their surroundings and come to expect outcomes pre-linguistically and express surprise when they encounter something non-causal. Across our species, the common experience of coming into the world through our shared range of senses creates a basic narrative grammar that allows us to use and adapt stories our brains do not write as our own. The species-level advantage of this narrative capacity is enormous, but it also makes us vulnerable to narrative blips. A good example of this comes from the work of Michael Gazzagna and Joseph Ledoux. Ledoux, by the way, teaches here at NYU, and I had the privilege of tutoring his son in ancient Greek many years ago. So in their work, in their early work, it illustrates well the human tendency towards confabulation. In their series of experiments with patients who had separation between the hemispheres of the brain, disconnected images were reassembled artificially through narrative. Causal connections were fabricated to cope with disconnected data. What emerges from their experiment is a clear example of the impulse described by Michael Turner as a tendency to transform event stories, things that just happen, into action stories, stories with agents. Not only are our brains wired in such a way as to invent a story rather than leaving something unexplained, but the type of story we create tends to have agents and objects based on individual experience and cultural beliefs. And I've just given you a lot of things I haven't talked about. The handout and the slideshow are online at academia.edu if you want it. The human desire to bring a narrative to its end comes as no surprise from a literary perspective either. Drawing on psychoanalysis, critics a generation ago like Peter Brooks saw the death instinct operative in both the pleasure derived from moving towards a text end and a concomitant impulse to delay that end or to repeatedly return through the same movement. This is confirmed, too, by psychologists who study the effect of death anxiety on human behavior. Narrative functions both to safeguard us against mortal fear and to give us meaning despite it. Critics have explored and plotted different generic and cultural attitudes towards narratives that affect closure and those that appear to remain open. Indeed, many readers have seen a dialectic between openness and closure as an indication of sophisticated narrative of what some might call literature. But much of this leads us down interpretive paths that are both closed and endless. As the late classicist Don Fowler writes, whether we look for closure or aperture or a dialectic between them in a text is a function of our own presuppositions, not of anything objective about the text. The Odyssey makes its final book in part about how to end a poem. But this theme itself capitalizes upon both the narrative it has developed prior to this book and an understanding of human psychology. From psychological and literary perspectives, audiences desire to know how a story ends, but are also troubled by the fact that it must end. The epic anticipates these themes as well in the opening exchange of Book 24 with the invocation of Penelope's weaving. When Amphimedon, and now I'm moving on to the next sign, tells the story of the death of the suitors to Agamemnon, the longest part is Penelope's trick of promising to marry after she has completed a burial shroud for Laertes, and then weaving and unweaving her work every night until she's betrayed. This story illustrates Penelope's guile, increases her likeness to her husband, and explains how she resisted the suitors for so long. In addition, since the tale likely was famous outside of the epic, it stands as a particularly Homeric way of appropriating and embedding popular tales. Yet, this is the third time in the epic it has been described, and I list some of this with the bibliography on the handout. In Book 2, Antinous tells the tale to the assembled Ithacans, and then in Book 19, Penelope herself narrates the story to a disguised Odysseus. The repetition facilitates a meta-narrative reflection on Homeric art. While the language has only minor divergences, new details emerge with each telling. Among these differences, the final description joins the completion of the fabric with Odysseus' return and the completion of the Odyssey to a point. In his questing to tell a story that makes sense, Amphimedon actually weaves together a fairly dynamic picture of agency and causality. In addition, weaving is often a metaphor not just for intelligence, but for poetic composition in Greek culture and others. In the Iliad, Helen weaves a pharos that depicts, quote, the many struggles of the horse-taming Trojans and the bronze-girded Achaeans, and all the things they had suffered for her at Ares' hands. An ancient scholar recognized in Helen's weaving an embedded metaphor for Homer's own art, which he calls a worthy archetype for his own poetry. However, if we pursue weaving as a metaphor for the Odyssey's narrative art, we find that in most of the poem, its decoration goes undescribed. The lack of description might be less confounding if Penelope's delaying has not been understood as equivalent to the delaying narrative of the Odyssey. Barbara Clayton writes, quote, Homer's audience would have assumed an implicit narrative component in Penelope's web. Perhaps that she's depicting the heroic deeds of Laertes. Homer deliberately leaves the narrative content of the web within the realm of potentiality, and this aspect of potentiality in turn complements the fact that Penelope's web is potentially never complete, end of quote. The undescribed content of the shroud is a metaphor for the unbounded and incomplete nature of the Odyssey itself. It simultaneously responds both to our reluctance to end a tale and to our need to do so. Its completion, coterminous with Odysseus' return, seals its connection with that narrative. The refusal to provide an image on the shroud, or to describe that image that is there, leaves narrative work to the audience itself. We have to tell that story, just as I propose we have to manage what happens at and after the end of the poem. Now, the epic does not signal the importance of these themes in Book 24 alone. There's an anticipatory lexical pattern that echoes both the unboundedness of Penelope's weaving and the contradictory emotions invoked by wishing for a story's end. In Odyssey 1, Penelope descends from her quarters to find Telemachus and the suitors listening as Phemius sings the grievous homecomings of the Achaeans which Athena accomplished for them from Troy. Penelope asks for a different song because this one causes her penthos alaston, ceaseless pain. Telemachus clarifies that the tale means something different to him. Although it is the terrible fate of the Danaans, he supports it with two criteria. First, the most entertaining tale is the most recent one. And second, the grief is not Penelope's alone. Other men died during the return home. A similar passage brings the differences of these responses into sharper relief. When Telemachus makes it to Sparta from Pylos in Book 4, Menelaus confesses to indulging in grief frequently and singles out Odysseus as one who causes him pain that is also described as alaston. Here, the grief marked by the adjective alastos is steeped in uncertainty. Menelaus, like Penelope, does not know if Odysseus is alive or dead and cannot stop mourning because of this. Telemachus' comments in Book 1 and soon after, Menelaus speaks in Book 4, make it clear that he does not feel this grief because to his mind the story is over. He has decided that Odysseus is dead and therefore ends the tale. And I've given you some of those passages on the handout. The epic clarifies its own mixed message about what kind of story causes pain and pleasure later. Eumaeus the swineherd invites Odysseus to take pleasure in recalling our horrible griefs to one another, since a man may also take pleasure in his grief later on when he has suffered and gone through so many things. Here, the stories that have been told over and over are narrative experiences that communicate who the characters are. But when stories are incomplete and cannot be told, the epic marks them out as having a detrimental effect. Eumaeus reveals that he mourns without ceasing, alaston again, for Telemachus, because he does not know if the boy is alive or dead, and it causes grief because he is helpless to effect any change at all. But there's an additional significance to the adjective alastos that appears here. Its etymology points most clearly to the meaning unforgettable, marking something that cannot be forgotten no matter how hard one tries. The final example of unforgettable grief in Book 24 helps to explain not just the usages that precede it, but also the epic's final death. When Eupeithes speaks to address the Ithacan assembly about the deaths of the suitors, the narrative describes him as suffering unforgettable grief, penthos alaston again, over the death of his son Antinous. At first, this might seem like a very different situation from the earlier ones. Here, Antinous' story is over. He's dead. According to Eupeithes, he and the other families are due to pay back Odysseus for the deaths of so many Ithacans, or else suffer reproach in the future. So strong is the impulse that Eupeithes would rather die than go on living without completing this story. To make the attribution of alaston penthos here to Eupeithes especially powerful, there are two features. The first is etymological. Already by the time of Homer, the related noun alastor for avenger was active. The man who seeks and exacts vengeance is one who by nature cannot or will not forget. The second force exerted on this passage is formulaic or thematic. How Eupeithes' penthos alaston resonates with the themes present in its other uses, and there is a table on the handout. In the Iliad, Thetis has penthos alaston as she grieves for Achilles, whose death she cannot prevent. In the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, the Trojan king Tros feels unforgettable grief when his son Ganymede disappears. And in Hesiod's Theogony, Rhea has the same emotional response when Kronos eats her children. In each case, the inescapable emotion comes from a situation outside the character's control. It is related to a strong emotional bond and happens during paralysis or inaction. In these examples, the formulaic invocation of grief depends upon a narrative pattern. It issues from a lack of resolution, from not knowing whether one thing or another has happened. When the pattern is applied to Eupeithes and for the end of the Odyssey, it induces a variation that threatens a different end to the tale. Each of the strands of the epic's narrative are clipped or tied off, but Eupeithes' unforgettable grief enacts a paradigmatic pattern. Children are open-ended tales. They are the narratives that go on after the end of the parent. A dead child is still not a closed tale if the parent is alive. Revenge is the primary end offered by convention. In part, the resolution the gods manufacture is aimed towards the threat of this endless cycle. Athena poses the problem to Zeus, and his solution is simple. We will make them forget what has happened, and everyone can live happily ever after. Of course, nothing is that simple. Eupeithes is a scapegoat sacrificed to secure the Ithacan peace. Now, this is the end that I find troubling. But I want to end this talk by suggesting that it works in concert with the beginning of Book 24 and the signs of closure I've discussed. First, the ending is a false direction. We know from Tiresias' prophecy in Book 11 that Odysseus will leave Ithaca again. On a lexical level, the one, eklesis, the forgetting, is an undoing. It's an unweaving of the other, alastos, since both of them develop from the root of forgetfulness we find in Lanthano. The opposition of memory and forgetting is binary, not polar. It emerges from the selection of one narrative in preference to another that is required for the creation of communal and individual identities. The message of the end of the Odyssey is that we, the audience, can choose our own narratives to fit the outcomes of the tale and the outcomes in our world. In a way, we are like Penelope, weaving and unweaving possible tales until we are finally forced to commit. But the ending signals that not choosing an end is as dangerous as choosing the wrong one. So the poem's resolution by oblivion has psychological ramifications. In my longer project, I focus on how the epic probes the relationship between agency and self-narrative. The importance of self-determination in life is reflected in the ability to control the tale. To consume narrative passively, however, is to be at somebody else's mercy. The epic features audiences deriving pleasure from listening to stories, but these audiences largely have bad things happen to them. The stories are to no avail for the suitors, who are slaughtered. Odysseus entertains the Phaeacians. They reward him with a trip home. They get a mountain dropped on them, perhaps. And it's a type of erasure of their culture. Others are tortured by the tales they hear. Penelope and Menelaus languish in anxiety about what might have happened to Odysseus. Eupeithes' grief forces him to choose between shame and vengeance. Telemachus, however, faces his father's unknown fate, journeys to hear more tales, writes an ending to the story, and returns home to act. This pattern of marking off open-ended narratives by prolonging the action and making us yearn for the end of Odysseus' tale also sets us up for disappointment so that we will reconsider what type of audience members we are. It is in this turn that the epic reflects most severely on storytelling itself, capitalizes upon our attraction to it, and helps to explain its own difficult ending. The forced end of the Odyssey runs the risk of giving its audiences something unresolvable and unforgettable, of leaving us with penthos alaston, a type of aporia, and I'm really grateful to the presentation on aporia before because it makes me see this even more powerfully. It's a type of aporia that invites us to go back to the beginning and examine the problem again, to question the decisions that were made. If revenge is wrong for Eupeithes, was it wrong for Odysseus? Was there some other way the suitors could have been handled? Who is the man who has come home? Are we supposed to be like him? Odysseus lives to see another day. In fact, so do we. The epic manipulates a human need to know how stories end or impose paradigmatic endings on open-ended tales, in part to develop a contrast between the stories we tell and the lives that we live. The one figure who survives and thrives manifestly masters and manipulates narrative. He gets delayed, he loses control of the story, but once he begins to return, he reclaims agency in part through the stories he tells, the Phaeacians, and the lies and deceptions he weaves in his return to Ithaca. While those who passively consume narrative either become his instruments or his victims, those who wait to hear the end of his tale feel an anguish they cannot forget because someone else is in charge of their stories. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for the opportunity to present my research. So thank you to the organizers for this fantastic and stimulating event. So I don't have much time. I'm really conscious that at 5 we have to leave. So I'm going to try and keep it short. I'm going to try because I know myself. I go on and on and on. So I'm going to have that and stick to the text. But I will make a short introduction. as you see, my interest from the publications is in Aristophanes and comedy. Many of my publications have in the title celebration, celebratory inclusivity, and all that. The reason I ended up doing this paper, or I was interested in positive emotion, was because I was first introduced to Aristophanes, and Greek theater for that matter, but particularly Aristophanes, when I was a child. So when I was very young already, I started going to the theater. Because in Greece, every year in the summer, you have these annual fantastic festivals that are held in a big Epidavros ancient theater. Of course, it's the later theater, the 4th century ones that have fantastic acoustics, not the 5th century. But still, those events, and I can call them only as events, are kind of stuck in my memory, and they've always been, because when I went there, I can only describe it as an event in the sense that when you gather and you've got thousands of people there in an open-air amphitheater, the atmosphere is almost overwhelming. So for me, this atmosphere, okay, and the emotion and the responses that are generated within this fantastic venue, which of course I know it's not the 5th century, it's a 4th century venue, but still the volume of the event is fantastic. And when people see comedy and they respond or they laugh to a joke, suddenly it's kind of catchy. And I know there's been a lot of research on the kind of contagious and the contagion of laughter. But someone starts laughing, people start giggling with other people's laughter, and it's just kind of contagious. In the same way, when music sounds and melodies or popular melodies start coming on, and in Aristophanes, of course, modern interpretations use music a lot. Music, of course, that are familiar for our culture, but still very much engaging. There have been occasions where in the middle of the performance, when the chorus sings and dances, you have people starting to clap or to do that kind of bop, bop, bop with it. And it's catchy as well, exactly like the laughter. So kind of within that performance of comedy, you have this fantastic, uplifting atmosphere that is just generated, and it's just fantastic. And you feel so happy and so joyful. And that is something, I think, from reading the texts, and it has nothing to do with staging, you know, how they look or whatever. It's the atmosphere that when we're looking at a text or when we're analyzing, we really can't capture. And of course, we can't imagine how it was then. But if you do go to these places and people are all together and, you know, you start singing or you're listening to these kind of familiar melodies, you can imagine that probably it was as uplifting and upbeat. So I thought, okay, what a liberating experience watching Aristophanes, and what a joyful experience. Does that do something? How does that affect how we look at the comedy? How does it make us appreciate the comedy in a different way? So we're listening, we're watching at all these figures, going up and down, moving energetically, of course, making their jokes, distorted, funny in appearance. And we're listening to all that. But that mood that we're in, that positive mood, that's an underlying feeling, sometimes you're conscious of it, sometimes you're not, that energy, does that affect the way I process the comedy? And that's when positive psychology came into all this. And I was fascinated to see so much research that has happened in the relationship between emotion and cognition. And not in the sense that what I see induces an emotion. Of course, what I see induces an emotion. But how the emotion then that I feel feeds in and affects the way I process what then I see. So it's a kind of two-way thing. So the appreciation of what I'm watching is modulated. The cognition is modulated because of the emotion I am experiencing. And there's been a lot of research on this. So I'm going to start by showing you the key research that's been going on. So I'm going to go now and stick to my text, or else I will be here all day. So decades of research have suggested that affective experiences, such as emotional feelings and moods, influence not only the content, but the structure of thought, shaping how individuals think, as opposed to merely what they think. A large amount of research, for example, has shown convincingly that positive emotions influence performance on many cognitive tasks, especially creative problem tasks. So, for example, if you're feeling positively and you're trying to do a task that is probably different, so the nature of the task also affects how good you are and how well you engage. So with creative cognitive problems and tasks, positive emotion seems to work really well. Alice Eison's extensive work on the subject, which extends over 2 decades, provides the strongest evidence that positive emotion broadens cognition and facilitates creative thinking. Her conclusions fit with Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory, which has proposed that positive affect, and here Barbara Fredrickson looks specifically at specific emotions. Eison was more abstract on this. Mirth, specifically joy, love, but it includes mirth, amusement, being entertained, and joyful, which has proposed that positive affect, including mirth and joy, broadens one's scope of attention and thought-action repertoire. It also fits with Rose and colleagues' more recent work that proposes that positive emotions, such as feeling amused, results in the relaxation across the semantic and visual spatial cognitive domains, increasing the breadth of information available for cognitive processing. So what does that mean? Rowan proposed that in the visual spatial domain, positive affect results in a leaky attentional filter, allowing peripheral irrelevant information to be more fully processed. In the conceptual domain, positive affect is associated with increased capacity to generate remote associates for familiar words, indicating that access to internal semantic information is facilitated by positive affect in a way that more distant semantic associations, possibly even from long-term memory, seem closer and more easily accessible. For example, when participants in experiments here are asked to come up with semantic associations for the word pen, those in a positive affective state generate more unusual and diverse associations, such as barn or pig, stemming from their unusual interpretation of pen as a fenced enclosure, as compared to those in a neutral state who come up with the same high-frequency associates, such as paper. In another creative thinking task, which is called the remote associates test, participants are presented with a list of cue words and are asked to find a fourth that is related in some way to each of the 3 on the list. The given words are gown, club, and mare. In this case, the response that connects all words is night. Researchers found that those in a positive affect were more accurate in their responses. In this example, to produce the word night, participants must overcome the dominant cognitive set that the correct word must be semantically related to the cue words. Instead, participants must consider alternative ways in which words might be related, such as being part of a compound word. Ashby and Eison were the first to connect that the observed broadening and flexible way of thinking to increase levels of dopamine, providing for the first time a description of the neuropsychological mechanisms that underlie the influence of positive affect, including mirth, on cognition, bridging existing disparate literature on positive affect and cognitive literature on cognitive broadening and novel thinking. More specifically, the dopaminergic theory of positive affect assumes that creative problem solving is increased and creativity is enhanced partially because increased dopamine release in the anterior cingulate improves cognitive flexibility and facilitates the selection of cognitive perspective. And here, I'm not going to go into this, but basically, I think this was mentioned yesterday in the keynote as well, that they relate this increase in dopamine to the kind of reward system that exists in us. And basically, the more pleasure you feel, and including amused or happy, you want more of it. And in anticipation of that, kind of dopamine is, enhanced levels of dopamine is kind of transmitted. And some of these higher levels are kind of transmitted, and some of the paths end up into the frontal cortex, and that's the reason that the broadening occurs. So they kind of scientifically now, neurobiologically explain the phenomenon of broadening, which is very interesting. I don't have time to go into it, but it actually brings together all this research. Here is how it works, and again, it shows how the kind of dopamine is what makes you think of the remote associate or generate kind of more diverse and more unusual interpretations of what's the low, the high frequency one. But having said that, you're still aware of the high frequency one. So you're kind of aware of many possibilities at the same time, which is very, very interesting, I think. Now, building on Ashby's and colleagues' dopaminergic theory, it has also been proposed, and this is actually very interesting as well, although there's so much literature on laughter and smiling, but actually it has been proposed that induced smiles increases, again, dopaminergic activity in various brain regions, among them the midbrain dopamine system in the prefrontal cortex, suggesting that the expressive component of an emotion could both induce positive emotion and modulate cognition. So we've got a kind of embodied cognition. So when I'm smiling, like that, something happens. And, you know, I'm starting to process things and bring things together differently. More recently, it has also been proposed that implicit positive affective cues may instigate psychological responses analogous to those traditionally associated with conscious emotional arousal. So even if you're not aware that you're feeling joyful or you don't have these conscious feelings, still you might have that broadening because of what's happening around you. You're in a safe and a positive environment. At this point, it is important to clarify that many of the demonstrated effects of positive effects, such as flexible, creative, and unusual thinking, might be better conceptualized as consequences of the broadening of focus, rather than synonyms to it. So basically, creativity comes as a result of that. And there's a nice quote here from Zabelina, who has done a lot of work on creativity, and actually she looks at dopamine as well, to explain how that works. So, what now has all this to do with Aristophanic audiences? So let's go back now to Aristophanes. If we're to approach Aristophanic comedy as a positive and a vibrant environment, which exposes audiences to various creative cognitive tasks that often requires one to go beyond the information given using associations and inferences, but also find alternative and novel ways to connect seemingly unrelated items, the suggestion that positive emotions such as mirth and joy increases one's ability to solve creative cognitive tasks and find diverse and unusual solutions to open-ended problems becomes particularly insightful. Although it is important to acknowledge that theater is not a laboratory and words presented as autonomous items on a piece of paper, like happens in those experiments, are perceived differently to those that are found within a particular dramatic and performance context where the storyline as well as the prosodic and paralinguistic signals affect understanding, it is undeniable that words and actions carry a particular set of meanings depending on the diverse abilities and past experiences of the audience. In Aristophanic comedy, where the narrative structure is relatively loose and does not always follow a consequential logic, the physical actions and elusive language of the characters can frequently be approached as separate and autonomous items open to free association and multiple interpretations, making them almost comparable to creative thinking tasks and open-ended problems. As Silk argues, the Aristophanic vision requires possibility to be left open and not to be closed down prematurely. This facilitates audiences to engage creatively in the meaning-making of the comedy. In order to do so effectively, however, it is important to be in a creative state of mind, which in the realm of positive psychology has been associated to feelings of joy, amusement, and laughter. So here I've talked at the beginning a little bit about the atmosphere and the fact that Aristophanes is actually full of music, rhythm, musicalized speech. So I'm not going to repeat it here because I know I'm conscious of time. And I'm going to go straight to this multiplicity of meaning and creative cognition in Aristophanes. Silk talks of Aristophanic comedy's use of discontinuity and accumulation as part of the poet's broader comic vision that sees and conveys the world in sequences as much as consequences. As Silk observes, the sequences of autonomous items that are observed in many of Aristophanes' passages are difficult to grasp, as they're unmediated by abstracted casuality, but follow a simple parataxis, and a reluctance to subordinate words, phrases, and clauses. This seemingly non-casual accumulation of items in the text are also often reflected in Aristophanic staging. In his article, Multiplicity, Discontinuity, and Visual Meaning in Aristophanic Comedy, Joe Park Poe talks of Aristophanic comedy's distinctive feature of multiplicity, which means that Aristophanes gives his public a great deal to see. People, things, and people doing things simultaneously on stage. And it is true when you try to stage Aristophanes, the busyness of the stage is a characteristic. This is not a static thing. Things are happening constantly whilst people are talking. People come and go. These actions are not always mentioned in the text. And this in Poe's view are an expression of the comedy's openness and absurd nature. For example, frequently actors run into the skinny in the middle of a dialogue, normally to fetch something, like the Geopolis basket of charcoal in Acarnians, returning soon, if not immediately, while spoken dialogue continues. And in Poe's view, in tragedy, gestures and physical actions are pointed out in the text to emphasize their significance, something that does not happen in comedy. So tragedy's tendency to hierarchize and to focus on what is most meaningful encourages iteration, action for the sake of emphasis, and you could argue that that encourages a more concentrated attention. So the play itself makes you concentrate. In contrast to this, in Aristophanic comedy, the action seems more various and undirected. So with reference to the comedy's multiple entrances and exits, Poe observes, what is humorous about a succession of exits and entrances to fetch an altar, a basket, a goat, a lustral water? What is funny about the spectacle of the comings and goings of neutral figures like mute attendants? I think there are two complementary answers to these questions. One is simply that the part of old comedy's humor seems to lie in the violation of the dramatic norms of tragedy, and the second, more basic answer, however, is that comic openness can extend beyond absurdity to meaningless. Poe's observations highlights the openness of the comedy in terms of interpretation. But what Poe describes as meaningless, I would argue, is actually probably not that. Especially if one is to accept that audiences have adopted or might have adopted a cognitively flexible mode of thinking and a broadening of attention as a result of being in a positive and uplifted mood. The comic action of these exits and entrances, I would argue, is not meaningless but open to multiple readings, allowing the spectator to engage creatively with the performance and to bind diverse and seemingly unrelated items in novel ways. The suggestion that positive emotion enhances a more holistic processing of external visual space, which involves attending to more visual stimuli simultaneously, would have made this task all the more effortless, especially in an ancient open-air amphitheater where audiences were much more aware of their surroundings. As already mentioned, positive mood states are associated with greater global or holistic processing versus local processing. This involves attending to more stimuli in both external visual space and internal semantic space, potentially derived from long-term memory, allowing access to more information to simultaneously influence creative solution efforts. The juxtaposition and often accumulation of many seemingly incompatible and or unrelated items in Aristophanic comedy, especially in the poet's earlier plays, which also happen to be some of his most buoyant comedies, creates a climate of radical ambivalence, which, as Platter argues, forces audiences to choose from a broad range of interpretive possibilities. This choice of possibilities, however, I would argue is not forced upon comic audiences, but would have been facilitated by the emotive state of the spectator, which would have induced a creative mode of thinking and a broadening of attention. Creative thinking has often been described as a kaleidoscope, where a myriad of ideas and associations thrill together into a variety of viable interpretations. It seems to me that when one adopts a flexible mode of thinking, this lack of Aristotelian causality or multiplicity of action is not difficult to grasp, because the brain is instantly able to consider a broader array of interpretive options and discover alternative and novel ways in which word sounds, actions, stage objects, and sentences could relate to each other. If in a relatively neutral state, however, like for example when trying to read the comedy in a more neutral emotive state, it is most likely that this discontinuity in accumulative narration may at first cause frustration or may require more effort in an attempt to find alternative ways to make sense of the comedy. As a result, people may reject to interpret what at first seems incomprehensible, labeling it as meaningless. The pleasure that comes from Aristophanic comedy relates to the audience's ability to be adaptive to the play's sudden changes of content and tone, but also the frequent transitions and or combination of high poetry and low life concepts. One of the key aspects of cognitive flexibility is that it permits audiences to adapt instantly to new situations, but also to be conscious of all possible alternatives in a given task that is characterized by ambiguity, such as it happens in wordplay, which was another key feature of the comedy. And Aristophanes himself showed a preference towards the use of homonymic words, with the player Carnians alone having 49 instances of homonymic wordplay and paronymy. And I do have an example here of a sentence which has so many meanings. Honestly, this sentence is lovely. I borrowed it from Platter, but it could mean 3-5 different things if you read it. And it's really interesting how that open meaning, so there's no one way of reading the humor. You could have a same sentence having 5 different ways of interpreting it and it being equally humorous. And the same with the characters. They could be seen as operating at different levels. They're kind of polymorphic in a way, and Michael Vickers, I think, mentions in his latest book how that kind of characterization, that you're operating at different levels, and when you're in a flexible mode, you might be able to understand that. And I'm going to end with a point that says that flexible thinking, this broadening and flexible way of thinking, is not only a byproduct of positive emotion, and this has been suggested, but that it also induces positive emotion, increasing the probability that those who are in a creative mindset will sustain their positivity over prolonged periods of time. In the context of Aristophanic performance, it also points towards the possibility that comic audiences were more likely to sustain a positive affective state, not only because of the positive atmosphere, funny appearance and actions of the characters, but also due to their flexible and creative way of processing those actions. The person's ability to understand and gain pleasure from this kind of playful and interpretively open humor would seem to depend, at least partly, upon ideational fluency, associative fluency, and a cognitive flexibility, which comes as a result of feeling amused and joyful. From this perspective, the feedback loop of positive emotion, which would have been generated from the very start of the performance, could have potentially facilitated a full appreciation of Aristophanes' open vision of life. Thank you.
Thanks for that very kind introduction, Peter. I'm the last guy, so I have no time limit, right? Bill said earlier that he gave his presentation for the first time with PowerPoint. This is my first presentation without PowerPoint, so I feel very exposed. Tacitus, like Thucydides, was acutely aware and interested in what motivated historical agents. His histories includes analysis of the psychology of his main characters, but since the first 4 books describe the year 69, when civil war stalked the land, Tacitus is also concerned with the behavior of large bodies of troops, that is to say, with what we today would call social psychology. In this paper, I want to examine Tacitus' use of the term vulgus, or rabble, to describe bodies of Roman troops, and link his descriptions of their motives and behavior to the psychological processes of the crowd that marked their transition from army to rabble. For the sake of time, I'll restrict my analysis mostly to the material from Book 1, but my handout ranges more widely. Quick explanation of the handout. The first section is a timeline of events for those who might not be terribly familiar with what happened in Roman history in the years 68 through 69, though I can't imagine how you wouldn't be familiar with that information. The second is a collection of texts, which I'll be referring to as text 1, 2, 3, and so forth, and we'll be looking at. And the third section on page 4 is all the references to Vulgus and Tacitus' histories, broken down according to who they refer to. Tacitus uses the term vulgus 59 times in the histories, 23 of those times, or 39%, to denote Roman troops. In 4 of these references, the term is used neutrally to distinguish just the common rank-and-file soldier from the officers. So that means that in 19 of 23 appearances, vulgus has a somewhat different coloring, and we're going to look at that in a minute. Now, Tacitus did not have to use this word vulgus. He had other choices, which indeed he deploys from time to time in his book. Milite is the most common word to describe Roman soldiers, or phrases like gregarius miles, common soldier, or manipularis, member of a maniple, which appear also in the histories. That using vulgus is not just an artifact of typical Tacitean variatio is made clear by surviving accounts of these same events penned by other authors like Suetonius, Plutarch, or Cassius Dio, none of whom use vulgus or the Greek equivalents, plethos or oklos, to describe Roman troops. To recognize the power of the force of Tacitus' word choice here, we must appreciate the associations vulgus habitually evoked in the Roman mind. An undifferentiated mass of people or animals, such as the urban mob or hordes of barbarians. The epithets that appear with vulgus in the histories include mutabile, fickle, immodicum, unruly, stolidum, dumb, credulum, gullible, and ignavum, lazy or cowardly. The vulgus indulgence its every whim, is excitable and unreliable, craven in its behavior, fickle in its allegiance, and base in its tastes. At Histories 437, text 1 of your handout, Tacitus notes that the vulgus needs a leader to save it from succumbing to its own wretchedness. And on 36 occasions in the histories, as documented in section 3b of the handout, Tacitus uses vulgus in this normal way to describe various entities such as the urban mob or provincial townspeople and so on. Now, these regular uses only stress the pejorative force of the 19 occasions when Tacitus uses vulgus to denote bodies of Roman soldiers. Tacitus is not afraid to make things explicit. Thus, in text 3a, we read, when the zeal of mutinous Vitellian troops faded, they became happy, laudatory, and joyful, since the rabble is immoderate in either direction. And in text 3b, when Otho's troops suspect a legionary legate of treachery, Tacitus writes, they roundly rebuked him as a deserter and a traitor, not due to any crime of his, but rather in the manner of a rabble. Each accused someone else of their own disgrace. End quote. Here, Roman troops display cardinal characteristics of the vulgus: immoderation, fickleness, and timidity. The proper Latin term for an army was exercitus, the trained or disciplined thing, governed by good order. The exercitus is marked by a clear chain of command. It exhibits courage, virtus, and steadfastness, constantia, in its actions. Orders are obeyed, the military regimen respected, and disciplina prevails. Vulgus is pretty much the opposite of all of that, and Tacitus and his readers knew it. Crowd dynamics, I argue for the rest of the paper, played a role in the process of transition from exercitus to vulgus. So a brief explanation of at least the cardinal features of crowd dynamics that I'm going to be talking about today is in order. In recent years, the old 19th century Libonian model of crowd dynamics has undergone a major reconstruction. Whereas Liban envisioned individuals in crowds losing their capacity to think, finding their individual selves subsumed into a collective mind, and then, as a result, becoming highly suggestible by being open to any and all stimuli in their vicinity, more recent views have proceeded from the processes of social identity and social categorization that are inherent to group membership. On this perspective, members of crowds share social understandings and find in the expression of the crowd's social identity a powerful and affirming sense of validation and belonging. These are potent emotions indeed, and I'm sure all of us have experienced them firsthand at crowd events. This paradigm effectively replaces Le Bon's model of submergence into a collective mind with one of emergence of a shared social identity. When the crowd is focused on a leader, its identity is usually quite clear, and of course it's open to manipulation. Its emotions readily channel down certain paths. We can think of frightening historical events and equally frightening more recent ones. But when the leader is absent, the expression of the crowd's social identity can be less obvious, so that crowd members take their cues from those around them. Most people go to crowd events with friends or acquaintances, which makes the crowd, in effect, an aggregate of smaller groups to begin with. As stimulus cues move through the crowd, the individual members will often be already known to those in their immediate vicinity, and this mutually reinforces the validity of observed behavior. This is why people who ordinarily would not go about putting trash cans through shop windows will do just that in a riot. Much depends then on the nature of the stimulus cues that course through a crowd, how those cues are transmitted and received by the subgroups that constitute the crowd, and how the cues serve to express the social identity being manifested by the crowd. Finally, the physical presence of outgroups, or else their evocation by a leader, strengthens the crowd's identity, since by being categorized as outside the crowd's social identity, outgroups buttress the in-group's feelings of cohesion, belonging, and validation. Such are the essentials of the mental dynamics underlying crowd behavior. Can their workings be detected in Tacitus' portrayal of events in the histories? I argue they can, and to explore this possibility, we'll take two case studies from Histories Book 1, Otho's coup in Rome and the massacre at Dividorum. Otho's coup first. Otho, again, I refer you to section 1 of the handout if you're not familiar with who Otho is and what happened, mostly the left-hand column. Otho had been a partisan of Galba's when Galba was governor in Spain. In fact, he was his first prominent supporter. But when the two men reached Rome, probably in the fall of the year 68, Otho began to suborn the loyalties of the Praetorian Guard. These were the bodies of about 10,000 or so troops that were stationed in a camp on the Quirnel Hill at the outskirts of the city. That figure, 10,000, rises to about 23,000 if we include the urban cohorts and the night watch, the vigiles. Now, the Praetorians, it should be noted, were already primed for revolution by having supported the ill-starred coup attempt of their commanding officer, Nymphidius Sabinus, the previous summer. Again, see section 1 for the details. But as Galba drew closer to Rome, the troops got cold feet about this guy, Nymphidius, and they turned on him and they murdered him. Yet Galba repeatedly put off the payment of a promised cash handout, a donativum, to the troops. Otho saw an opening and began working on turning the Praetorians' loyalties toward himself. On the 15th of January 69, Otho made his move. As he attended Galba sacrificing on the Palatine, he received a signal that all was ready. He sneaked out and made his way down to the golden milestone near the Temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum. There, to his utter horror, he found 23 speculatores, or mounted Praetorians, waiting for him. Not a huge body of troops, 23 guys, who on the spot acclaimed him emperor. Terrified by the paltry number of the troops, Otho was bundled into a litter and carried off to the Praetorian camp. As they went along, Tacitus notes in text 4a in your handout, about the same number of soldiers joined them on the journey, some out of complicity, some out of astonishment, some shouting and with swords drawn, others in silence, waiting to take their cue from the outcome. End of quote. At the camp, Tacitus describes the frame of mind of the soldiers as Otho approached in text 4b of your handout. Their attitude was such that a few dared the vilest crime, that's going to be the murder of Galba, the sitting emperor. More wanted it, and all allowed it. End quote. Once he was brought inside, the men enthusiastically broke for Otho, and he became their emperor, and Galba was subsequently murdered in the Forum, in fact. In this account, Tacitus uses vulgus twice, see text 5a and b, to describe the Praetorians, and both usages appear in the first phase of Otho's plan, the undermining of the Praetorians' loyalties. Otho, we read in text 5a, would very often let drop complaints or double-edged comments about Galba, and whatever else stirs up the rabble, end quote. And then text 5b, two of his agents who were working the troops goaded wavering minds with various tricks, the leaders of the soldiers on the grounds that they were suspected because of benefits received from Nymphidius, the rabble and the rest, by arousing their anger and desperation at the donative so many times put off. The fickleness of the vulgus is the key component here, and by using the term early, Tacitus hints that the seed of a rabble was already incubating in the Praetorian ranks. Now, several facets of crowd dynamics are traceable in Tacitus's account. As Rhiannon Ash stressed, Tacitus is unique among ancient writers in disaggregating the mass of soldiers into different subgroups with divergent motives, aspirations, and reactions. Until Otho reaches the camp, he's openly backed by about only 50 or so guys on horseback, and they bring their own varied expectations to the larger gathering. It's in the camp that things change, and in a crucial passage, Tacitus shows us the crowd forming before our eyes. This is text 6 of your handout. First, the mass of troops, here it's called the agmen, the mass, crowd around Otho on the speaker's platform in the camp. Then the common soldiers prevent their commanders from approaching, warning that the officers especially have to be watched. In fact, this deep suspicion of officers is a central plank of the Othonian crowd's, or mob's, social identity. We've seen it emerge. We've seen it emerge in text 3b. This happens a bit later, but it's the same sense of deep suspicion of commanders. Now, the roots of this suspicion are never plainly revealed to us by Tacitus, but the abortive coup of Nymphidius, I would think, is the most likely cause. The Promores Militum, remember, in text 5b, had received the beneficia from Nymphidius, but the rank and filers had their promised handout repeatedly denied. In a sketch of Nymphidius' coup in 1.5.2, I haven't got that on the handout, Tacitus notes that the majority of the soldiers retained a guilty conscience about this whole incident after Nymphidius had been suppressed. The officers would have been and that they resented Galba's stinginess and his commitment to old-fashioned military discipline. Galba was a guy in his 70s at this point. Now, the officers would have been, of course, the enforcers of that discipline, and yet the soldiers knew that those officers had received benefits, whereas they had received nothing. They'd basically been stiffed. This, I think, was the cause of the schism, and in psychological terms, this means that the rank-and-file troops of the Praetorians had come to regard their own officers as an outgroup. Returning to Otho in the camp, we get this extraordinary scene, back to text 6 of your handout. There was uproar everywhere with shouting and chaos and mutual encouragement, note that. Not as happens among the people and the plebs with their varied yells of lazy adulation. But as the troops saw individual soldiers approaching, they grasped them with their hands, surrounded them with their weapons, drew them close, led the way in taking the oath, and commended now the emperor to the soldiers, and now the soldiers to the emperor. Otho wasn't idle, stretching out his hands in adoration of the rabble, throwing kisses, I love that detail, in every way acting the slave to become the master. We see here the initial uncertainty of the crowd as a whole, and the stimulus cues starting to course through the mob. Hesitant newcomers are actively brought into its social identity, its burgeoning sense of validation and empowerment, and its increasing focus on a new leader who, of course, plays his part to the full. It is in this scene that the Praetorians finally descend from army to rabble. The troops have rejected their officers. They have demolished the chain of command. They've ceased to obey orders. In fact, common soldiers are now giving the orders, saying, look out for those officers, keep them away. Tacitus's account brilliantly captures the psychological complexity of the situation as it unfolds, from the handful of partisans greeting Otho at the Golden Milestone in the Forum, to the varied motives coursing through the troops, to their generally unsettled attitude, and then their antagonistic attitude towards their officers, to the final solidification of their support for Otho in the camp. The seed of the vulgus Tacitus had alluded to at the outset has germinated and blossomed, and the executus has become a rabble. Our second case study is a somewhat unsettling incident recorded by Tacitus in Book 163, which is text 7 of the handout. After the armies of Upper and Lower Germany had declared for Aulus Vitellius, the commander in Lower Germany on the 1st through 3rd of January 69, it was decided that Italy would be invaded in a two-pronged attack. One column commanded by Aulus Alienus Caecina, the other by Fabius Valens. When Valens's column reached the town of Dividorum, which is modern-day Metz in France, the capital at that time of the Mediometrici tribe, the troops were welcomed with open arms as allies. But suddenly the soldiers got spooked, drew their weapons, and set to butchering the populace. This is text 7 of your handout. Not on account of, and this is what Tacitus says, not on account of loot or a desire to plunder the place, but out of a furious rage that sprang from uncertain causes, and for that reason, all the harder to remedy. Eventually, they were calmed by the pleas of their general and refrained from exterminating the community. Nevertheless, about 4,000 people had been butchered. End of quote. Tacitus can offer no explanation for why this happened. They didn't even do it for loot, he says. What could they have been thinking? But crowd dynamics, I suggest, can. The key to the incident lies in a crucial shift in the social identity of the Roman troops in Germany and how they came to recategorize both themselves and their Gallic neighbours in the wake of earlier events. At 151, text 8 of the handout, Tacitus outlines the legion's frame of mind immediately after their defeat of Vindex's troops in the spring of 68. And this is a passage worth reading in full because it's so rich. When Julius Vindex, along with all his forces, had been slaughtered, the army was made arrogant due to its plunder and glory, since victory in a very profitable war had fallen into its hands without hard work or risk. It now preferred campaigning, battle, and loot to regular pay. Men, weapons, horses were abundant for use or show. But before the war, the men had known only their own sanctuaries and squadrons. The armies were separated by provincial boundaries. Then, when the legions were assembled against Vindex, and they had gained experience both of themselves and the Gallic provinces, they looked once more for conflict and new dissensions. They called the Gauls not allies as before, but the enemy and the defeated. And so they became hostile towards the Sequani and the Aedui, these are two Gallic tribes, and eventually to Gallic communities according to their wealth. They obsessed about storming cities, ravaging fields, and looting houses. Beyond greed and arrogance, the foremost vices of the strong, as Tacitus calls them, they were annoyed by the insolence of the Gauls, who boasted as a way to insult the army that Galba had remitted a quarter of their tribute and given their communities gifts. The most abundant raw material for fiction and rumor spreading through the troops was in the camp themselves. Stemming from fear and loathing, and when they looked at their own strength, confidence. End of quote. The psychological currents here are complex but discernible. While Tacitus is clear that greed and the prospect of loot played a large role in the troops' calculus, what underlies all that is a shift in the army's sense of itself. Formerly parochial in their outlooks, the experience of mass mobilization against Vindex caused the troops to appreciate their own strength, and they naturally felt empowered by this. Note especially the reinforcing role of mutual visibility in this process. When they looked upon themselves, they felt that they were stronger. The troop's social identity has shifted from legionaries of this or that unit to members of a much larger and more powerful and threatening entity. Crucially, their new identity had an outgroup to categorize itself against. The Gauls, formerly the neighbours and allies of the legions, were now recast as the defeated and the enemy. Power differentials between groups have been shown to have a significant effect on crowd dynamics and how groups interact by modern psychologists, with the more powerful engaging in arrogant and prejudicial behavior against the less powerful. The difficult politics of the moment added fuel to the fire. By crushing Vindex, the German legions had effectively fought for Nero against an ally of Galba's. Galba was the sitting emperor, so that's bad. That's a bad start. But then they had acclaimed their own commander, Lucius Virginius Rufus, as emperor, and he'd said no thanks, and thereby extended his lifespan by 30 years, by the way. He didn't die until 97, whereas Galba didn't make it out of January 69. So their adherence to Galba already on thin ice then, these troops on the 1st of 3rd of January transferred their loyalty to Aulus Vitellius the governor of Lower Germany, yet the Gauls had retained their commitment to Galba, and this reinforced their categorization as an outgroup. The dynamics of the massacre at Dividorum, I think, can now be discerned. While the Gauls welcomed Valens's column with every courtesy as allies, the soldiers entered the town harboring stereotypical attitudes toward the Gauls as contemptible, less powerful outgroup and partisans of Galba to boot. Whatever may have sparked the violence, once it was started, these facets of the army's social identity, bolstered by its own sense of power and confidence, took over. Taking their cues from those in their vicinity, receiving no guidance from their officers, more and more soldiers would have joined in. In short, the expression on this occasion of the troops' social identity manifested itself as violence against the outgroup, which sadly is not an untypical event in human affairs. Although Tacitus does not expressly label the perpetrators of the massacre at Dividorum a vulgus, that it took place without orders and required the pleas of its general to stop it is enough to show that the army had lost its status as an exercitus. And Tacitus does brand the troops of Vitellius a vulgus on 9 occasions subsequently. So then, to conclude, Tacitus naturally shared the snobbery and prejudices of the senatorial class when it came to contemplating the lower orders. The social distinction in the Roman army between the common rank and file troops and their officers, drawn largely from the elite, the senators and the equestrians, played a role, no doubt, in shaping his narrative. But that does not mean his account lacks psychological insight. More than any other ancient author, Tacitus stresses the complexity of the motives of large bodies of troops. Reading his account through the lens of crowd dynamics is, I hope I've shown, an interpretive strategy that finds and adds further nuance to Tacitus's already multi-layered account and helps us chart the process of how an exercitus became a vulgus. Thanks for your attention.